As we turn our attention to the 2025 fantasy season, I wanted to dive into 7 of my favorite buys in all of Dynasty Fantasy Football right now, spanning all 4 positions. So let's start with the quarterback position with new Raiders quarterback Geno Smith, currently being valued as the QB 28 on Keep Trade Cut, as essentially the last solidified starting quarterback. It's him and Matthew Stafford, then whoever ends up being the quarterbacks for Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and New Orleans. And I understand why Geno is this far down the rankings, but at the same time, he's produced well enough and at a high enough ceiling on a weekly and even season-long basis recently that he should be higher as just a top 25 option in Dynasty instead of barely even top 30. He was the QB 5 overall in 2022 in his big breakout season as the new quarterback for Seattle under Pete Carroll and David Canales. Then he was QB 19 overall in 2023, which was kind of predictable. He wasn't going to sustain the top 12 production 2 years in a row, especially after losing Canales to Tampa Bay, but he was still a top 20 guy on the entire season. Then last year, Geno quietly finished as the QB 13 overall, literally just 7 fantasy points behind Justin Herbert. So for 3 years in a row, Geno has well outproduced a QB 28 value with 3 straight top 20 finishes and multiple top 15 finishes. Now he's in Vegas, which I would argue is actually an upgrade over his situation in Seattle. While the Raiders' offensive line isn't all that great and not really significantly better than Seattle's, it is better than Seattle's, and they drafted 2 guys on day 2 this year to help address some of their depth after all the injuries last year, not to mention that they were a significantly better unit over the second half of last season. Sure, not throwing to DK Metcalf and Jackson Smith and Jigba anymore doesn't sound all that fun until you remember that he's throwing to a group of Brock Bowers, Jacoby Myers, rookie Jack Bech. Even Trey Tucker is a quality NFL wide receiver 3 or 4 as his new Tyler Lockett speedster. I do think that they would benefit from one of the 2 veteran free agents still out there in Amari Cooper or Keenan Allen, but they're still more than okay without those guys at receiver. And of course, having Ashton Genty is a huge upgrade over Kenneth Walker, both as a runner and a receiver out of the backfield who can help to sustain drives, get more red zone opportunities, or even just take a screen pass 60 yards to the house, which would count for fantasy points for Geno Smith. And then there's the new offensive system in place in Vegas. Pete Carroll comes in for some head coaching stability and also some familiarity with Geno Smith from Seattle. Chip Kelly returns to the NFL with his fast-paced, very explosive system that has already had fantasy success like 10 to 12 years ago. In 2013, Nick Foles was a QB 16 overall in 13 games played, but was actually the QB 3 in fantasy points per game for Philadelphia under Chip Kelly. In 2014, the combination of Nick Foles and Mark Sanchez would have been good for QB 10 overall. In 2015, Sam Bradford and Mark Sanchez combined for a top 20 fantasy quarterback. Then in 2016, with the San Francisco 49ers, Colin Kaepernick and Blaine Gabbert combined for another top 10 fantasy quarterback performance under Chip Kelly. So you're telling me that Geno Smith, who was already a floor top 20 fantasy quarterback, more likely a top 15 fantasy quarterback, is now in an offensive system where Nick Foles, Mark Sanchez, Sam Bradford, Colin Kaepernick, and Blaine Gabbert had a lot of success, some to the tune of top 12 quarterback upside, and I can get that at QB 28 prices in Dynasty? As a contender, how do you not buy into that as your QB3 or even streamable QB2 in your Superflex spot? Even as a rebuilder, you can buy him super cheap right now, then flip him in season to somebody who really needs him for more than what you paid for while he's producing. According to the DLF Trade Analyzer, you can buy Geno right now for 2 late seconds in a Superflex league, maybe even just 1 earlier second. Someone was actually able to buy him for Dallas Goedert straight up in a tight end premium league, or Zach Charbonnet and Roman Wilson for Geno Smith in Superflex again. In one quarterback, someone bought Geno for Tyler Algier straight up. You got Kirk Cousins and a pick swap in the 2nd round pick for Geno Smith, or even just a couple of 3rd round picks. You don't have to pay all that much for some additional quarterback help in either format for a guy who could easily be a top 15 quarterback again this year, if not even returning to his 2022 form as a top 10 guy. Buy Geno Smith. Now let's move over to the wide receiver position, and we're going to start with a big name, probably the biggest name on this entire list in this whole entire video. It's Nico Collins, who I noticed has slowly been sliding on Keep Trade Cut rankings from being around wide receiver 6 in December to now around wide receiver 9 or 10 as we head into the summer. For what reason? I really have no idea, but I love the thought of people getting softer on Nico Collins' value because then I can come in and I can try to buy him. From my wide receiver rankings video that I posted a couple weeks ago, I believe that there are 8 tier 1 wide receivers in Dynasty right now. The absolute best of the best, the alphas, the elite studs, guys that you want multiple of on your Dynasty teams, and Nico Collins is one of those guys. He has proved that he is 2 years in a row now. I get that if you were hesitant last year after his breakout 2023 to value him as a tier 1 guy after just 1 year of production, but he did it again in 2024, and the path is clear for the next few years for him still being the alpha on the Houston Texans connected to CJ Stroud. 17.4 PPR points per game in 2023 as the wide receiver 7, right behind Puka Nacua, then 17.6 PPR points per game in 2024 as the wide receiver 8, tied with CeeDee Lamb, right behind Malik Nabers and ahead of Brian Thomas Jr. The Texans have now lost Stephon Diggs in free agency. Tank Dell's not going to play at all this year, and they replaced those guys with Christian Kirk and 2 day 2 rookies who neither should have any impact on Nico Collins' role or target share in this offense. He is an alpha. The only concerns that I could understand you maybe even have are health and age, kind of to a degree. He missed 2 games in 2023 and then 5 games in 2024 with injury, so maybe that's something that you have to be okay with, just missing a couple of games every year, if that even really is an issue. But I don't think Nico Collins' injuries are like a T. Higgins thing, where you constantly have to worry about his availability, or even a Puka Nacua thing, who's had injuries in college and then has had injuries in both years as a pro. Sometimes guys just miss a couple of games every now and then. Nabers missed a couple games last year. Lamb missed a couple games last year. A.J. Brown missed games. Devontae Adams missed games. I don't view injuries as an issue yet for Nico Collins, and I think that it's just as likely that he plays 17 games this year as it is that he plays under like 14. I'm not really concerned about it right now. And if you are worried about his age, I really wouldn't be. He's a very young 26 years old. He just turned 26 in March. He is literally 3 weeks older than CeeDee Lamb and just 3 months older than Justin Jefferson. And I don't hear anyone asking if we should be worried about Justin Jefferson or CeeDee Lamb's age right now. Plus, not to mention that Nico is under contract with the team through 2027. So I don't think anyone should have any concern about his age or his situation as the now current and future wide receiver 1 in Houston. The only question then is just price, which if you're anything like me, I go hard for these elite wide receivers in trades. I personally would take Nico Collins over every single running back in Dynasty right now. Every single one. I know people don't agree with me, but I build my team around wide receivers, and I would trade away Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Ashton Jeanty, plus anyone else behind them, all straight up for Nico Collins right now. If you're able to get something on top, even better, because he's behind all 3 of them on keep, trade, cut, but I would trade all 3 for Nico straight up right now. But if you're a little hesitant about making a splash move like that, you want to go for Nico Collins, but you don't want to go as hard as I would for him, I would try maybe just multiple first-round picks. I would try a lower-level running back like a Kyron Williams or a James Cook. Maybe you got to add a second to one of them to get to Nico Collins. I would do a couple mid-tier wide receivers like Jalen Waddle and Zay Flowers, George Pickens and Jordan Addison for Nico Collins. On the DLF Trade Analyzer, you'd find trades of the 109 and the 110 for Nico, Kenneth Walker and Chris Olave for Nico, Devon Achane straight up for Nico Collins. Someone even tiered down from CeeDee Lamb to Nico Collins plus Keon Coleman and Tyrone Tracy, a move that I'm not sure I fully endorse with those added players specifically, but I love the idea of an Amon-Ra for Nico plus, a Puka for Nico plus, even Nabers or Brian Thomas Jr. for Nico Collins plus, if that plus was worth it. If you play Dynasty at all like me and you build around wide receivers, you should be actively trying to buy Nico Collins right now if his price is truly slipping. Moving a little down the wide receiver rankings, they're actually moving down a lot. I had to go all the way down to wide receiver 43 before I hit Khalil Shakir, which I think is in part due to some rookie fever around this time of year because people are preferring guys like Jaden Higgins and Trey Harris, maybe even a Jack Besh over a player like Khalil Shakir. And no disrespect to those rookies, but Khalil Shakir should be ranked ahead of them. He's a proven NFL and fantasy football talent. He's still just 25 years old and is probably in a better situation than all 3 of those guys, plus some other veterans that are being valued ahead of Khalil Shakir as well. Sure, if you're playing the upside game, maybe Shakir's upside isn't all that massive. He probably will never sniff a top 12 fantasy finish, but 12.2 PPR points per game as the wide receiver 37 in both overall points and points per game is not insignificant to your roster, especially when you can buy him for under that production. And for all intents and purposes, 2025 is pretty much year 2 for Khalil Shakir as a full-time starter for the Buffalo Bills. He barely played at all in 2022 as a rookie, didn't really even see significant snaps in year 2 until like week 9-ish, and even then was still more of a part-time player to end 2023. But when Shakir did play a more full-time role in 2024, he was really good. In the 10 games that he played at least 55% of snaps last year, Shakir was on pace for over 1,000 yards and just a handful of touchdowns on almost 130 targets. He saw 7 or more targets in 6 of those 10 games, broke 50 receiving yards in 7 out of 10 games, 60 or more yards in 5 of them, and he was just a quality PPR fantasy producer who could easily get you 12 or more fantasy points a week without even scoring a touchdown. He is still effectively the wide receiver 1 for the Buffalo Bills because they really didn't do anything to address the position other than signing Josh Palmer, which who really cares, and then Elijah Moore for just backup money. Not to mention that Khalil Shakir himself got a 4-year extension through 2029, so he's tied to one of the best offenses in the league and arguably the best quarterback in the league for 5 more years. And he can absolutely be their wide receiver 1 for most of or even all 5 of those years too. He's the same height and 1 pound lighter than Amon-Ra St. Brown. He's the same height and 4 pounds lighter than Malik Neighbors. Same height, 5 pounds lighter than Jamar Chase. So there's no size issue here inhibiting him from being an NFL wide receiver 1. There's no talent issue either. He's proven on the field to be a very talented and athletic wide receiver. He just needs more playing time and just a little bit more volume, and he could have that in 2025, competing with just Keon Coleman and Josh Palmer, Dalton Kincaid for targets. He is 100% the best wide receiver that Buffalo has right now. As I mentioned before, I would take Shakir over pretty much all of the second-round rookie wide receivers this year, even guys like Cam Scadaboo and Bashal Tootin, any of the tight ends like that. So I would happily trade an early second, even multiple seconds this year for Khalil Shakir right now. On the DLF Trade Analyzer, he's been traded for Jalen McMillan and Blake Corum. And yes, that trade happened last week. Stephon Diggs in a 26th second for Shakir. Ayuk for Shakir and Dalton Kincaid. Brian Robinson for Khalil Shakir straight up. It really doesn't take a lot to pull him away as either a starter in your lineup as that wide receiver 3 or flex spot, or the first guy off the bench just in case of injuries. He works for contenders or rebuilders given his age and the upside in 2025 for a big value gain, not to mention the production that he could have. He just should be a guy that everybody is looking to buy. Now, not too far behind Shakir is another great wide receiver buy right now in Courtland Sutton, who is the wide receiver 47 on Keep Trade Cut. Now, I understand this price a lot more because Sutton is nearly 30 years old, so he does fit as a contender-only piece that only a few teams in every league are probably even interested in. But if you are a contender and you don't currently have Courtland Sutton, you should be one of those teams looking to buy him right now. The argument here is very simple. He's the wide receiver 1 for an ascending Bo Nix in an ascending Sean Payton offense. He was the wide receiver 15 in total points, wide receiver 26 in points per game last year with over 14 PPR points per game, which is less than 1 point per game under Ladd McConkey, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Garrett Wilson. You could get that level of production in 2025 as a contender for wide receiver 47 prices. He put up nearly 1,100 yards and scored 8 touchdowns on 135 targets last year, and he really was the main offensive piece for Denver other than just Bo Nix himself. I could see how you could worry heading into 2025 when Denver adds Evan Ingram, they add RJ Harvey, plus the shot on day 2 pick Pat Bryant to play opposite of Courtland Sutton, but I don't think that any of these new additions really matter all that much for Sutton's overall production this year. Harvey's target share is very easy to explain away. Javonte Williams somehow saw 70 targets last year, so if Harvey sees that in 2025 as a rookie, then it's basically just a wash from last year to this year. We got Little Jordan Humphrey, Lucas Kroll, Adam Troutman, and Greg Dulcich all combined for 100 targets last year, so there's your Evan Ingram target share. And that's not even counting the 160 plus targets that Devon Vele, Troy Franklin, and Marvin Mims combined for that could get redistributed just depending on playing time for all these guys, with Pat Bryant now in the mix. Essentially, the Broncos are going to throw the ball 550 plus times this year, and Courtland Sutton is going to be penciled in for 130 or even 140 of those targets. Then the rest of the team will get dished out from the remaining targets. Sutton is not competing with anyone. He is their wide receiver one. He is Bo Nix's first target, and that's that. Everybody else is just going to have to figure it out behind him. And with that role in target share in this offense, Sutton is going to produce as a solid fantasy wide receiver 2 once again in 2025, making him an easy buy for contenders at super cheap prices. He's in that same price range as Khalil Shakir for me, maybe even a little bit lower to where you shouldn't have to pay multiple seconds for him like I would with Khalil Shakir, but an early to mid second, trade up from the guys like Deebo Samuel or Jalen McMillan or Stephon Diggs or Xavier Legette, trade down from guys like Jerry Jeudy, Brandon Ayuk, Tyreek Hill, and that's your Courtland Sutton buy range as a contender for 2025. Before we get to the running back position, I do have one tight end that I'm looking to buy right now, very similar to Courtland Sutton given his age as a contender-only piece, but it's Jonnu Smith. Again, a very easy argument here because it's really just based on the Dolphins offense repeating what they did to end the year last year, which was quick throws around the line of scrimmage, get the ball out of Tua's hands to keep him healthy, and that was immensely favorable for Jonnu Smith. From week 11 on, Jonnu was on pace for 117 receptions, 1,150 yards, and 15 touchdowns. He saw 8 or more targets in 5 of those 7 games, 11 or more targets in 4 of those games, topped 85 yards 3 times, scored 7 times in 8 games. He was insane. He was literally outscoring Brock Bowers over that stretch and was a half a fantasy point behind Trey McBride as the tight end 2 to end the year. It was just bonkers fantasy production. But even before that huge stretch, starting in week 11, Jonnu was still pretty solid for fantasy over the first half of the year too. It did take him a month to get going in the offense and even play over 40% of snaps consistently, but once he did, from weeks 5 through 10, he still paced for 82 receptions, over 900 yards, and 3 touchdowns, just in that 4 or 5 game sample size before his massive breakout. For reference, that stat line alone would have made Jonnu the tight end 6 last year, ahead of Mark Andrews and Sam Laporta, and just barely behind Travis Kelce. And those games included games with and without Tua, and before Jonnu really took over for this offense with massive PPR numbers. So his ceiling, as we saw last year, is a top 3 fantasy tight end if Miami just keeps their same offensive game plan from the end of last year, which did work, by the way. They went 5-3 while Jonnu was going nuts, and it's not like their offensive line got any better, so they might have to continue throwing quick just to make sure that Tua does stay healthy. But then his floor does look like a regular, just top 12 fantasy tight end, which may not be much different than a bunch of other guys, but I do think it's nice to know that he has a baseline of production in Miami's offense without needing Tua to get the ball out of his hands in like half a second. He can still be a very viable fantasy option as the third option on this team with good touchdown upside and PPR production. But that baseline of production feels even more important when you see that Jonnu Smith is the tight end 20 on Keep Trade Cut. He's behind guys like Jake Ferguson and Evan Ingram and Pat Freiermuth, David Njoku, Isaiah Likely, Tucker Kraft, Dalton Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, all guys that sure might outproduce Jonnu at his floor or produce very similarly as like fringe top 10 or even fringe top 12 guys, but I don't think any of them have that ceiling upside of what we saw to end the year last year for Jonnu Smith. So that in and of itself makes him just a way more intriguing dynasty buy for contenders than a lot of these other guys, especially then when you factor in that he's cheaper than all of them. You could probably buy Jonnu for a late second at most, maybe even a couple of thirds right now. I would even dangle like a fun upside wide receiver like Cedric Tillman or Jalen Coker, Rashid Shaheed, Tank Dell to somebody who's really rebuilding. Maybe someone like that and add like a 3rd round pick if you can to get Jonnu Smith. Move someone like Cooper Kupp or Stephon Diggs, Deebo, Michael Pittman for Jonnu Smith. Trade away that fun bench running back that you have like a Najee Harris or a Jalen Warren for Jonnu and just get a guy that can be a difference maker for your lineup if his ceiling outcome hits again in 2025. Now, let's get to the running back position, and I have 2 pretty big names here to buy because I do think that both of them are at a very nice discount right now that aren't just straight up 1-year rentals for 2025 and have some longevity and some juice in them for the next 2 to 3 seasons. The first of which are Jonathan Taylor, who is RB10 on Keep Trade Cut for really only one reason. He's 26 years old. He is 2 to 4 years older than everybody above him minus Saquon Barkley. So he is penalized for his age in Dynasty but I just don't really care. In 2020, he was the RB6 for fantasy. In 2021, he was the RB1 overall. 2022, he was injured, RB33 overall, but RB23 in fantasy points per game. 2023, again, some injuries, RB33 overall, but RB12 in fantasy points per game. Then last year, RB12 overall, RB7 in points per game. So 5 years in the league, he has been an end-of-season RB1 in 3 years and a points per game RB1 in 4 years, with really just that 2022 season being lost to injury. But when he's played at least 14 games, his baseline numbers are pretty much 1,500 total yards and 12 touchdowns floor when healthy. His upside, as shown in 2021, 2,000 total yards, 20 total touchdowns, and you can get that right now at RB10 prices. Jonathan Taylor is the engine of this Colts offense. They still don't really know what they're doing at the quarterback position. They still have the same wide receiver room that they've had for the past couple of years. They've added Tyler Warren, but this offense still flows through Jonathan Taylor. Nothing is going to change that. He is immensely talented. He has tremendous athleticism for his size, and he has the speed to take any play to the house. And one aspect of his game for fantasy that has been lacking lately is receiving volume. He hasn't actually had over 20 receptions since 2022, which I think we can blame on Anthony Richardson's running ability, Joe Flacco's don't really care attitude for just the lack of dump offs to Jonathan Taylor. But Jonathan Taylor is a solid pass catcher. And if we can get him back into the 20s, that would be a start. But even back into the 30s for receptions like he was in 2020 and 2021, that would be huge for his fantasy floor and ceiling. He was the RB12 last year in total fantasy points, but give him 10 more receptions, and he's knocking at the door at basically a top 8 or 9 fantasy running back. Maybe the receptions aren't there with Anthony Richardson this year, but Saquon Barkley was in the 40s and 50s with Daniel Jones, so getting Jonathan Taylor to 30 could happen if Daniel Jones plays enough games. It's really not what I'm buying Jonathan Taylor for, is the expectation of increased receiving volume, but it would be a huge cherry on top if his receiving work does come back this year. The DLF Trade Analyzer has seen Jonathan Taylor be bought for Rashee Rice straight up, which works for me depending on how you feel about Rice or your depth at receiver and running back. We also have T. Higgins for Jonathan Taylor straight up. Again, depends on your feelings on T. Higgins and your overall team need. Someone actually bought Jonathan Taylor and Ladd McConkey for the 1.02 and 2.02. Massive steal there. The 101 straight up for Jonathan Taylor. The 105 and a 1 quarterback straight up for Jonathan Taylor. Laporta and a 27 first for Jonathan Taylor and George Kittle. Absolutely love that deal. I wouldn't buy JT right now for 2 firsts unless it was like the 112 and a 26 first or something, or if you do get a kickback on that deal, but a first plus something is a solid starting point right now for a trade to get done and to just go buy Jonathan Taylor as a contender for 2025. And the last running back and just last player in this video, we have Chase Brown, the current RB18 on Keep Trade Cut, who just continues to slowly lose value even after surviving the NFL draft and being in the same situation he was in last year as the PPR RB10 on the year. I think people just got really scared of Chase Brown before the NFL draft, thinking that he was going to get replaced or at the very least getting some decent competition added. And even though that didn't happen, I still think those fears are being translated for 2026, even though I think it's really less likely that Chase Brown gets replaced next year in a worse running back class, especially if he has an even better season in 2025 that even further solidifies him as the Bengals RB1, especially with 1 year left on his very cheap rookie contract. To me, this feels like Kyren Williams all over again. Kyren had that unexpected year 2 breakout after winning the job over Cam Akers, but he lost value in the offseason from the Rams drafting Blake Corum, then the whole punt returner saga, which was extremely stupid to buy into. But guess what? Kyren had another fantastic fantasy season in 2024 and survived the draft again in 2025, paving the way for yet another probably fantastic season in 2025 and maybe even a contract extension. Remember, Brown didn't even start the year as their RB1. He was in a committee with Zach Moss and then slowly started taking over until Moss eventually got hurt, pushing Chase Brown into the absolute bell cow role, a role in which he absolutely thrived. In 11 games from week 6 through 17, Brown was on pace for almost 1,200 rushing yards and 8 rushing touchdowns, plus another 505 through the air. And that includes games with Zach Moss when he was still playing under 65% of snaps. From week 9 on, where he played a minimum of 70% of snaps every week, he was on pace for over 1,300 rushing yards, 600 receiving yards, 12 total touchdowns, averaging 20.5 fantasy points per game as a top 4 fantasy running back. It was Saquon, Bijan, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Chase Brown as the only running backs to average over 20 points per game over the second half of last season. Now, I don't think that Chase Brown is going to do that over the entire 2025 season, but it does show his weekly upside because of the volume that he should and probably will receive again in 2025. To stick with that Kyren Williams comparison, Kyren averaged 17 PPR points per game in 2024 as the RB7 overall and RB10 in fantasy points per game. If that's what Chase Brown is going to do this year, then sign me up. We know this Bengals offense is one of the best in the league. We know their defense is still pretty subpar, which means they're going to have to score more points to keep up with teams and win games, which means quicker drives, more scoring opportunities, more receiving opportunities, all of which just equals more fantasy points for Chase Brown. In the DLF trade analyzer, someone traded away Zay Flowers straight up for Chase Brown. That is an amazing deal. Someone else traded away Devonta Smith for Chase Brown straight up, Jordan Addison for Chase Brown, Xavier Worthy for Chase Brown and Deebo Samuel, Ricky Pearsall for Chase Brown, Ayuk and a 27 first for Chase Brown and Courtland Sutton. There's a bunch of trades in there as well, with Brown being a super late 25 first, like 111 or 112, which I would pay right now for Chase Brown. Or if you're a contender, you have your 26 first, I would pay that for Chase Brown right now as well. There's also this monster of a deal that I love so much that I just had to bring it up. It is Jahmyr Gibbs for Christian McCaffrey, Chase Brown, and a 26 first and second. Wow. I mean, that is a production win if I've ever seen one for 2025. You get two potential RB1s, one of whom might even outscore Jahmyr Gibbs straight up this year if he's healthy, plus future draft capital just for value installation purposes. If you have Jahmyr Gibbs, you need to go and do the deal like that. And honestly, for everybody else out there, just go buy Chase Brown right now.